The guy actually laughed. Not the nervous kind of laugh people do when they end oppos. Uncomfortable, not the awkward chuckle that says, end quote, "Hey, maybe we can work this out?" End quote. No, this was the kind of laugh that comes from someone who genuinely believes they and oppos, untouchable, and standing there on his front porch, leaning against the doorframe like he owned the entire neighborhood. That and oppos. Exactly what my neighbor, Brandon Keller, looked like. I still remember the way he crossed his arms and smirked at me. End quote. "Can you prove it?" End quote, he said. Just 5 words. 5 words that would end up costing him thousands of dollars. Now, before I tell you what happened next, you need to understand something about Brandon. Every neighborhood has that one guy. The guy who mistakes tolerance for weakness. The guy who thinks rules are suggestions. The guy who walks around acting like everyone else and oppos. Property is just an extension of his own. For us, that guy was Brandon. My wife and I had lived in our house for almost 6 years. Quiet street, decent neighbors, nothing fancy, just the kind of suburban community where people wave when they drive by and bring over cookies when someone moves in. Then Brandon bought the house across the street. At first, he seemed normal enough. Friendly smile, firm handshake, talked a lot about his fishing trips and weekend adventures. Honestly, I thought we and oppos did get along. Then the boat showed up. An enormous fishing boat sitting on a trailer, parked in his driveway. Again, not a problem. Lots of people own boats. The problem started about 3 weeks later. Every morning, around 6:15 a.m., I and oppos hear the same sound. Metal wheels rolling. Trailer hitch rattling. A low grinding noise. The first time I looked out my front window, I thought I was seeing things. Brandon had backed his truck across the street and rolled the boat trailer directly into my driveway. Not beside it. Not near it. In it. Like it belonged there. I watched him hop out of the truck, adjust a few straps, then walk back across the street carrying a coffee mug. The entire operation looked so casual that for a second I actually wondered if I and oppos somehow missed a conversation. Maybe there was a misunderstanding. Maybe he thought nobody lived here. Maybe he and oppos made a mistake. So later that afternoon, I walked over. End quote. "Hey Brandon," end quote, I said, trying to keep things friendly. End quote. "Just wanted to ask if you could avoid parking the boat in my driveway." End quote. He blinked at me, then smiled. End quote. "Only for a few minutes every morning." End quote. End quote. "Yeah, but it and oppos still my driveway." End quote. He shrugged. End quote. "Doesn't and oppos seem like a big deal." End quote. That should and oppos been my warning sign. Because normal people hear a reasonable request and think, okay, fair enough. Brandon heard a reasonable request and immediately started looking for ways to challenge it. The next morning, the boat was back. The morning after that, same thing. Then again. By the second week, it had become part of his routine. Like he was proving a point. Like every time he parked there, he was reminding me who he thought was in charge. So I went over a second time. This conversation was less friendly. End quote. "Brandon, seriously, stop putting the boat in my driveway." End quote. He laughed. Actually laughed. Then he took a sip of coffee and said something I and oppos never forget. End quote. "Relax, man. You don and oppos own the neighborhood." End quote. I stared at him. End quote. "You realize I literally own my driveway, right?" End quote. That made him laugh harder. And that and oppos when I started noticing something. This wasn't and oppos about convenience anymore. This wasn't and oppos about boat storage. This was about control. Some people get weird when boundaries are involved. The second you tell them no, they become obsessed with proving they can still do whatever they want. And Brandon seemed determined to win a competition that existed only in his own head. The real trouble started a month later. I was leaving for work when I noticed a small dent on the edge of my driver and oppos side door. Nothing huge, but it definitely had an and oppos been there the night before. At first I figured someone hid it in a parking lot. Then I saw a faint scrape mark near the bottom. Fresh paint transfer. White paint. The same color as Brandon and oppos boat trailer. Interesting. I took pictures just in case. No accusations. No confrontation. Just documentation. A few weeks later, it happened again. This time the damage was bigger. A longer scrape. A deeper mark. Still white paint. Still on the driver and oppos side. Still appearing after one of Brandon and oppos morning boat parking sessions. Now I was paying attention. Every morning I and Apo's glance outside before leaving. And every morning there it was. That giant boat, sitting in my driveway like some oversized monument to entitlement. The third incident was the one that pushed me over the edge. I walked outside on a Saturday morning and immediately felt my stomach drop. A long scratch stretched nearly the entire length of my vehicle. The protective cover hanging from Brandon and Apo's boat had dragged against the side panel while he was maneuvering the trailer. You could literally follow the line from front to back. No mystery, no guessing, just damage. Expensive damage. The kind of damage that makes you stand silently in your driveway for a few seconds while calculating how much this is about to cost. I took more photos. Lots of them. Close-ups. Wide shots. Timestamps. Everything. Then I scheduled an estimate. Then another. Then a third. The repair costs came back higher than I expected. Way higher. By the time all three incidents were added together, the total was sitting at just over $2,300. $2,300. Because one grown man couldn't and Apo's handle being told to stay off someone else and Apo's property. At that point, I figured maybe reality would finally get through to him. Maybe seeing actual repair estimates would make him understand. So one evening, folder in hand, I walked across the street. I knocked. Brandon opened the door. I showed him the photos. I showed him the estimates. I explained everything calmly. For a moment, he just stared at the paperwork. Then that same smirk appeared. The same one he and Apo's worn for months. The same one that said he thought he was smarter than everyone else. He leaned against the doorframe, crossed his arms, and smiled. End quote. That and Apo's unfortunate. End quote. I blinked. End quote. Unfortunate. End quote. End quote. Sure. End quote. End quote. You damaged my car. End quote. End quote. Did I? End quote. I pointed toward the boat sitting in his driveway. End quote. You know exactly what happened. End quote. He shrugged. Then he delivered the line that changed everything. End quote. Prove it. End quote. I stood there for a second, just looking at him. Because the funny thing was, he had absolutely no idea what had been recording him every single morning for the past 14 months. Now, before we get back to Brandon and his very unfortunate decision-making process, let me explain something that a lot of people misunderstand about neighborhood disputes. People assume these situations are usually about property. They and Apo's not. Most of the time they and Apo's about boundaries. And their and Apo's a huge difference. This is a psychological trap that shows up everywhere, not just in HOA communities. The moment someone gets away with crossing a boundary once, they start testing the next one, then the next one, and eventually the behavior itself becomes the reward. It stops being about the boat, the parking space, or even convenience. It becomes about proving they can do it. I and Apo's seen it happen with noise complaints, fence disputes, shared easements, even mailbox arguments. From a legal perspective, though, emotions Don and Apo's matter nearly as much as documentation. Photos matter. Dates matter. Witnesses matter. Video footage matters even more. According to standard procedure, insurance companies, code enforcement offices, and law enforcement agencies Don and Apo's care who tells the better story. They care who can prove the story. And Brandon and Apo's biggest mistake wasn't Apo's scratching my car. His biggest mistake was assuming confidence could replace evidence. Unfortunately for him, evidence was exactly what I had. I walked back into my house, trying not to smile. Not because I was happy. Honestly, I was furious. But there comes a point in certain conflicts where anger gets replaced by something much more useful. Patience. Brandon thought he had won. He thought the conversation was over. What he didn't and Apo's know was that I wasn't and Apo's planning my next argument. I was organizing evidence. The second I sat down in my home office, I opened my security app. A Ring camera had been mounted above my garage for over a year. Like most homeowners, I installed it for package thieves and random neighborhood nonsense. I rarely even checked it. That night, though, I started scrolling backward. 1 week, 2 weeks, 1 month, then 3. And suddenly I realized something. Every single morning when Brandon rolled that boat into my driveway, the camera had captured it. Every single time. I felt my heartbeat speed up. Not because I had one clip, because I had dozens. The camera had recorded motion-triggered footage automatically. Every arrival, every departure, every maneuver, every careless turn of that trailer. And there it was. The first scrape. Crystal clear. The trailer swung wider than intended and clipped the edge of my driver and Oppo's door. Timestamp visible. Trailer plate visible. Brandon visible. I watched it twice. Then 3 times. Then I found the second incident. And the third. The longer I searched, the worse it became for him. Minor contacts. Near misses. Encroachments. Behavior patterns. The footage wasn't Oppo's showing isolated accidents. It was showing a habit. A routine. A documented history of someone repeatedly using property that wasn't Oppo's his. By midnight, my dining room table looked like a detective in Oppo's workspace. Laptop open. Notebook filled. USB drives lined up. Coffee getting cold. I created folders by month. Then folders by incident. Each clip received a label. Date. Time. Description. Vehicle position. Estimated damage. By the time I finished, I had assembled 23 separate recordings. 23. And suddenly Brandon and Oppo's little and quote. Prove it and quote. Speech wasn't Oppo's sounding nearly as clever. The next morning I contacted the non-emergency police line. A responding officer arrived later that afternoon. Nice guy. Professional. Patient. I invited him inside and explained the situation. At first, he had the same expression most people have when they hear neighbor disputes. Skeptical. Probably expecting some petty disagreement over grass height or trash cans. Then I showed him the footage. The first clip. His eyebrows lifted. The second clip. He leaned closer. The third clip. He actually paused the video. End quote. You and Oppo's VE got all of this recorded? End quote. End quote. Every bit of it. End quote. He shook his head. End quote. Most people Don and Oppo's end quote. The report was filed that evening. Officially. Documented. Case number assigned. And that was only step 1. The following morning, I contacted my insurance company. The claims representative asked if I had supporting documentation. I almost laughed. Supporting documentation? I had enough evidence to produce a documentary series. Photos. Repair estimates. Video footage. Police report. Timeline. Incident log. The entire package was uploaded before lunch. Then things started moving much faster than I expected. A week later, I received a call from an investigator handling the claim. After reviewing the evidence, they agreed the damages appeared directly connected to Brandon and Oppo's trailer operations. The claim moved forward. But here in Oppo's where things got even more interesting. The investigator asked a question I hadn't and Oppo's originally considered. End quote. Was the boat legally stored on your property? End quote. I paused. End quote. No. End quote. End quote. Was it authorized? End quote. End quote. No. End quote. End quote. Have you verified local regulations? End quote. That conversation led me down an entirely different path. A path Brandon definitely wasn't Oppo's expecting. I spent that evening reviewing municipal ordinances. Now, I know that sounds incredibly boring. Trust me, I thought it would be too. Instead, it felt like uncovering hidden cheat codes. Because buried inside the city and Oppo's residential zoning regulations was a section dealing specifically with recreational watercraft and trailer storage. And according to those regulations, temporary placement of a trailered vessel on property not registered to the owner could trigger enforcement action under certain circumstances. Interesting. Very interesting. The next morning, I submitted a complaint. Nothing dramatic. No exaggeration. No emotional rant. Just facts. Dates. Times. Video evidence. Documentation. The city reviewed everything. Then they called. Then they requested copies. Then they requested more copies. Then an enforcement officer visited the neighborhood. At that point, I started getting the feeling Brandon and Oppo's week was about to become significantly worse. 10 days later, it happened. The first notice arrived at his house. Then another. Then another. I happened to be watering my lawn when I watched him walk to his mailbox. At first he looked confused, then irritated, then alarmed. Each envelope got opened faster than the last. By envelope number 4, his face had turned completely red. I wanted Oppo's pretend I wasn't Oppo's curious. A few hours later, I learned why. The city had accepted the documented timeline. Multiple violations. Multiple occurrences. Multiple citations. retroactively supported by timestamps and footage. The total penalties exceeded $4,000. And suddenly Mr. Prove it, wasn't smiling anymore. The best part? I hadn't even spoken to him. Not once. No gloating. No victory speech. No dramatic confrontation. Just paperwork. That the thing people underestimate. They imagine justice looks like a screaming match. Usually it looks like forms being processed by people in offices. About 2 weeks after that, my insurance company finalized its investigation. The damages were approved. Responsibility was established. And because insurance companies hate losing money almost as much as homeowners hate paying deductibles, they began pursuing recovery. The consequences started stacking up. Repair costs, administrative costs, potential premium adjustments, legal exposure. Suddenly Brandon and Apos' refusal to take responsibility for a $2,300 repair bill had become a much more expensive problem. Then came the phone call. Not from Brandon. From his attorney. Which, if we and Apos, being honest, is usually a sign that reality has finally entered the conversation. The lawyer was polite, professional, far more reasonable than his client. After introducing himself, he got straight to the point. My client would like to discuss resolving this matter. Of course he did. I leaned back in my chair. What does that mean exactly? There was a brief pause. Then the attorney explained that Brandon hoped we could reach an agreement regarding the outstanding disputes and enforcement actions. Interesting wording. Disputes. As though 23 videos somehow created room for debate. I listened quietly. When he finished, I asked a simple question. Has Brandon admitted responsibility? Another pause. Longer this time. He and Apos prepared to move toward a resolution. Translation? No. So I made my position very clear. I wasn't interested in vague resolutions. I wasn't interested in mutual understanding. And I definitely wasn't interested in pretending this had all been a misunderstanding. I said, before we discuss anything else, 3 things need to happen. The attorney waited. First, I want a formal written apology. Silence. Second, I want a signed agreement prohibiting him from placing any vehicle, trailer, boat, equipment, or personal property on my driveway for the next 3 years. More silence. Third, I want full reimbursement for every dollar of damage. The attorney sighed. Not angrily. More like a man realizing his client should have accepted responsibility months earlier. I and Apos relay that. The call ended. And honestly, I expected negotiations, counteroffers, arguments, something. Instead, less than a week later, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. Inside was everything. The apology, the agreement, the reimbursement commitment. Signed, executed, complete. Just like that. Months of arrogance had collapsed into a stack of paperwork. A few days later, I saw Brandon outside. For the first time in over a year, he looked different. No smirk, no swagger, no coffee mug confidence. Just a guy avoiding eye contact while checking his mail. Neither of us said anything. We didn't and Apos need to. The conversation had already happened. It happened through video files, insurance reports, official notices, signed agreements, and consequences. The funny thing is, people often ask whether I felt victorious afterward. Honestly, not really. Relieved, yes. Satisfied, absolutely. Victorious? No. Because the entire mess could have been avoided by a single sentence spoken months earlier. Sorry about that. I and Apos. Stop. That and Apos. All it would and Apos. Taken. Instead, Brandon chose the most expensive possible route. And in the end, the thing that defeated him wasn't Apos. Anger. Wasn't Apos. Revenge. Wasn't Apos. Some brilliant legal strategy. It was evidence. Simple, boring, organized evidence. The very thing he laughed at when he stood on his porch and told me to prove it. A few months after everything was over, the neighborhood felt strangely quiet. Not because anything had physically changed. The houses were still there. The lawns were still getting mowed. Kids were still riding bikes down the street. But the tension was gone. And that and Apos S when I finally had enough distance to think about what the whole situation actually meant. Because on the surface, this story sounds like it and Oppos, S about a boat, or a driveway, or a stubborn neighbor. But honestly, it ISN and Oppos, T. The lesson here is that most neighborhood conflicts aren't and Oppos, T created by the original problem. They and Oppos, recreated by the reaction to the problem. Think about it. The boat wasn't and Oppos, T what turned this into a disaster. The scratches weren't and Oppos, T what turned this into a disaster. Even the money wasn't and Oppos, T what turned this into a disaster. What transformed a minor disagreement into a full-blown legal and financial nightmare was pride. Pure, stubborn pride. Brandon had dozens of opportunities to change course. The first conversation. The second conversation. The first scratch. The second scratch. The repair estimates. Every step along the way offered him an exit ramp. And every single time, he doubled down. That and Oppos. S something I and Oppos, V noticed over the years. Some people become so committed to being right that they stop paying attention to reality. This is a psychological trap that catches more people than most of us realize. Once someone in Oppos' ego gets attached to a position, backing down starts to feel like losing, even when backing down is clearly the smartest option. Instead of solving the problem, they start defending their identity. And that and Oppos' dangerous. Because reality doesn't and Oppos' T negotiate with pride. The insurance company doesn't and Oppos' T care about pride. The police report doesn't and Oppos' T care about pride. The city ordinance doesn't and Oppos' T care about pride. Video evidence definitely doesn't and Oppos' T care about pride. Facts tend to win those arguments. Eventually. Another thing worth mentioning is documentation. People hear stories like this and assume the secret is having an expensive security system. It and Oppos' not. The camera helped. Absolutely. But the real advantage came from organization. Photos, dates, repair estimates, incident logs, records. According to standard procedure, most investigations become dramatically easier when information is documented properly. Whether you and Oppos, re-dealing with insurance claims, HOA disputes, property damage, contractor disagreements, or even consumer complaints, evidence usually matters more than emotion. A lot more. And here in Oppos, that's the part that surprised me most. The moment I stopped arguing and started documenting, everything became easier. Seriously, I wasn't in Oppos' T trying to convince Brandon anymore. I wasn't in Oppos' T trying to win debates. I wasn't in Oppos' T trying to force accountability. I was simply collecting facts. Once enough facts existed, the system handled the rest. That and Oppos' an important distinction. Because many homeowners waste months trying to reason with people who have already decided they don't and Oppos' T want to be reasonable. At some point, conversations stop being productive. At some point, documentation becomes the better strategy. From a legal perspective, that and Oppos' often where real progress begins. Not with threats, not with yelling, not with dramatic confrontations. With records, with evidence, with patience. Now, I know some people listening will probably think I went too far. I and Oppos' VE heard that argument before. Maybe you and Oppos, one of those people right now. Maybe you and Oppos, rethinking, and quote, come on, it was just a driveway, and quote. Fair enough. I understand that viewpoint. But here in Oppos, the question I and Oppos, D ask. If someone repeatedly ignored your requests, repeatedly damaged your property, repeatedly refused responsibility, and then laughed when confronted, what would you have done? That and Oppos' where the debate gets interesting. Because most people support accountability right up until accountability becomes expensive. Then suddenly they start feeling sympathy for the person who created the problem. Personally, I think consequences are most effective when they and Oppos directly connected to choices. Brandon made choices. Lots of them. The paperwork didn't and Oppos' T appear out of thin air. The insurance claim didn't and Oppos' T create itself. The citations weren't and Oppos' T random. Every consequence traced back to a decision he consciously made. And that and Oppos' why I don't and Oppos' T lose sleep over how things turned out. The outcome wasn't and Oppos' T revenge. It was cause and effect. There and Oppos' a difference. A very important difference. Today, whenever new homeowners move into the neighborhood and conversations drift toward property disputes, fences, parking issues, or HOA headaches, I usually tell them the same thing. Be polite, be reasonable, give people an opportunity to do the right thing. But never confuse politeness with passivity. Protect your interests. Document important interactions. Know your local regulations. Understand your rights. And if someone ever looks you in the eye and confidently says, and quote, prove it, end quote, make absolutely sure you and oppos been paying attention. Because sometimes the loudest person in the argument is also the least prepared person in the room. Anyway, that and oppos, that's my story. Now I and oppos am genuinely curious about yours. Have you ever dealt with a neighbor who thought the rules didn't and oppos apply to them? Do you think the consequences Brandon faced were fair, or do you think things went too far? And what and oppos the wildest thing you and oppos ever caught on a security camera? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read more of them than I probably should. And trust me, some of your neighborhood stories are even crazier than mine.